Thank you for making the effort to come. Let me at the outset explain why this investigation was initiated back in August of 2018. Our office has a dedicated team of attorneys and investigators who focus on both child sexual assault and child abuse cases. We litigate these type of cases throughout the state of Nebraska. We've made it a priority in this office to protect those who are most vulnerable. As a result, not only do we do investigations and prosecute these cases, we also provide training to law enforcement throughout the state. On July 2018, the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office released a grand jury report regarding statewide investigation of child sex abuse within the Catholic Church. I determined at that time it was appropriate for the Nebraska Department of Justice to issue a statewide release requesting any person who had been a victim of sexual abuse by a clergy member or other adults who are in a position of authority to call our 1-800 hotline number to provide us such information. It should be noted that we are well aware, those who work in this area, that a small percentage of victims are willing to come forward. This reluctance is due both to the shame associated with the sexual assaults and also a fear of reprisal. With that, we are well aware that our investigation will never be able to fully address the scope of harm those Nebraskans who have been sexually abused as a child. The intent of issuing the hotline was to receive information from any individual who had been subject to sexual abuse or misconduct at the hands of any individual with any religious organization. It was not our intent to pinpoint one particular church, but any religious organization in which they had children that they ministered to. Also applied to school officials, and we are also concerned about youth sports leaders. We were targeting abusers who had used their position of authority to groom, control, and sexually assault those under their authority. As a result of the hotline, we received 120 calls. All but one of those calls was associated with the Catholic Church. With the information obtained from the hotline, it was determined in late August 2018 that we would reach out to each of the 3 Nebraska dioceses and ask they provide us all investigative files that each diocese had in its possession dating back to 1978 regarding any claims of improper sexual exploitation by another person given authority by the diocese to carry out church functions. In that process, we are in regular communication with legal counsel representing each of the separate dioceses. I want to thank the leadership of each of the dioceses for their cooperation. Although there were areas of disagreement and points in the investigation that required clarification, in the 3-year investigative process, all the dioceses were cooperative. I also want to note that at the outset, we contacted the Lancaster County Attorney and the Lincoln Police Chief because we were aware that their offices were investigating a similar issue. As a result, it was agreed that all information received from the diocese relating to matters within Lancaster County would be reviewed by the investigators with the Lincoln Police Department. I'm very grateful for their professional assistance and their dedication to this matter. They are crucial in helping us review these files. In order to ensure our investigation was complete, I determined that it was necessary to issue subpoenas to not only the diocese, but other Catholic institutions whose information may be kept separate from the records of the diocese church, from the diocese. On February 19th, 2019, we issued, with the assistance of the Nebraska State Patrol, 426 subpoenas to individual Catholic churches and Catholic schools throughout the state of Nebraska. We also subpoenaed liability insurance companies who represented the diocese, and finally we asked the diocese to provide us all psychological evaluations of priests who were investigated for allegations of sexual misconduct. As a result of these requests, the scope of our investigation included the following information. We examined, along with the Lincoln Police Department, 200 files of either clergy members or employees of the diocese. We had 120 calls received to the hotline, a review of reports issued by the Lincoln and Omaha dioceses regarding their own internal investigations, and also other historical news stories and information reported on sexual assault by members of the church. We reviewed 12 hours of phone interviews with those who reported sexual assaults, and in total there were nearly 30,000 pages of relevant material generated in the investigation. From that review, we identified 258 victims. I want to go through some graphs just to briefly give a visual understanding of what we're looking at. In the 3 dioceses, you have the Grand Island, the Lincoln Diocese in the red, and the Omaha Diocese. One of the things to note about this geographical breakdown is you'll see that the numbers are very low in Grand Island, but as you look at this map, you can also understand and appreciate that the population base out there is going to be much lower than those affected by Lincoln and Omaha. The number of victims, 158 came from Omaha, 97 came from Lincoln, and 3 were identified for the Grand Island area. Victims by gender, 236 were male, primarily boys, and you'll see that in another graph. 22 were female. Broken down by gender in each diocese. Within the Lincoln Diocese, 92 were male, 5 were female. Again, you can clearly see through each diocese that there was a significant impact on males, particularly a certain age, which I'll show you later. These graphs are contained in the report that you can find on the website. This is one of the most troubling to me, and it's very consistent with the other reports that have been done. But this is the age, the victim's age. Predominant age seems to be from 11 to 15, but particularly 11 to 13. And often the stories involve boys who were altar boys within the church. As I said, this is very consistent. There are 3 other reports that we'd studied, which were the Pennsylvania report, the Colorado report, and the Iowa report. One of the things that's very significant about that is that the patterns are very consistent through all the other 3 reports. This one is also telling, it's by the decades. The hotline was a very interesting process. We had victims call in that were in their 70s to explain what they've been through. And some of those had never ever come forward before to tell their story. What's so significant is these time periods in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but you see certainly in 2000, that is the time period of the Dallas Charter, and I want to talk about that because from everything I've seen in our information and the information I've seen from the other 3 states, the Dallas Charter made a big impact. And this just generally shows you that the victims identified after 2002 was significantly, prior to the 2002 Dallas Charter, we had 97 victims. After, we've had 3 identified in Lincoln. In Omaha, 158. After the Dallas Charter, 12. Grand Island was consistent at 3 and 3. One thing I want to make clear is that it's not our suggestion that we have covered every, or have had received information of every violation, regardless of the time period. And although, as I say, the Dallas Charter seems to have made a difference, we know that there's victims outside these reports that we have, and that the harm to these victims is indescribable. During the course of our investigation, a few patterns became acutely apparent. In nearly every case, the offender engaged in some form of grooming behavior prior to committing sexual abuse. Grooming means contact designed to gain access to and time alone with a child to prepare him for sexual abuse by building a trusting relationship and emotional connection between the abuser and the child, and often the child's family. The summaries are replete with accounts of priests using alcohol, offering camping or other types of road trips, video games, food, and various other enticements to isolate and exploit their young victims. Perhaps the most concerning finding is that in several of the cases, church authorities had knowledge of the abusive behavior of the offenders and oftentimes failed to take sufficient steps both to investigate and stop the behavior. In various files, there were documented incidents where high-ranking officials, up to including bishops and archbishops, that established that such officials were well aware of the abusive behavior of the priest but did little or nothing to remove him from the ministry. Several of these offenders were sent away for counseling, but soon returned to ministry in situations where they had contact with children. We also reviewed incidents where victims reported their abuse to the priest or other officials, but no documentation of the report was found in the official parish files. Oftentimes, files were insufficient in providing any type of history of prior complaints. There were other incidents where the church failed to properly report information about sexual abuse of minors to law enforcement in violation of the Nebraska reporting laws. In other cases, church authorities proceeded to conduct in-house investigations before contacting law enforcement. As you will see in our report, a vast majority of the sexual abuse happened prior to the implementation of the Charter for Protection of Children and Young People, also known as the Dallas Charter. All of this was the post-2002 Boston Globe investigative story known as the Spotlight Investigation. And it is evident that the changes that were proposed in the Dallas Charter have resulted in a significant improvement as to the church's response to allegations of sexual abuse, and also in areas of hiring, screening, and setting forth protocols of not being alone with children. This significant change after the Dallas Charter was also noticed both in the Colorado and Pennsylvania reports, which in those reports we've included in our report these policies that have been adopted. So members of the church may not have looked at these ever before, but we encourage them to read through if they go onto the internet and see the extensive policies and procedures that have been adopted by their diocese. We're also encouraged from the reports issued post-2002 that contain accounts of important support provided to victims of sexual abuse by the diocese through the victim assistance coordinators. This extensive review has been a very difficult process. The nature of the harm caused to these young innocent victims is indescribable. The extent of physical and psychological harm caused by the perpetrators and the failure of the church to safeguard so many victims is gut-wrenching. Unfortunately, as a result of our statute of limitations law, we are unable to identify any case that would fall within the statute of limitations to criminally prosecute, except one in which the victim decided that they could not participate in prosecution. Our hope is that somehow this report will allow all victims to know at least that their voices have been heard. Going forward, vigilance in protecting our young people will be an important element to ensure that children are shielded from such acts of indecency. Also, accountability through our criminal justice system is mandatory. That starts with the reporting every incident to law enforcement immediately. I can't stress this message enough, that not only to the Catholic Church, but to any church and to any organization. Don't ever put the reputation of your association, your church organization above protecting the children. And in order to do that properly, it's imperative that you call law enforcement immediately and let us do what we're trained to do with regards to investigation. I also want to say that I do appreciate the comments I've received from many members of the Catholic Church indicating to me that as a member, this issue is so important to them. It's imperative not only for members of the Catholic Church, but members of all churches, schools, youth-related organizations to commit to policies and practices to protect our children from these pedophiles. We are the eyes and ears of our communities, therefore we must double down our efforts to help guard our young people from child predators. In conclusion, this has been a very painful history for not only the church, but for our state. I commend the Catholic Church for the appropriate steps that they have taken since the Dallas Charter in 2002 to ensure that such a terrible history will not be repeated. But it is upon the church, and it is upon us as members of churches, or just members in our community, to be diligent about protecting. It's one thing to adopt a lot of policies and procedures. It's another thing to hold the expectations that those in authority will follow through with these policies and to make sure that our children are protected. So with that, I will go ahead and open it up to questions. Yeah, Grant?
Are there, you talked about the statute of limitations having expired for the vast majority of these cases. Are there people in the church now who are working who have been accused, and has any action been taken against them to keep away children or anything like that?
I believe there's only one that is still associated with the church and has been moved to an administrative level, but the statute of limitations has expired on that. This concern with the statute of limitations is consistent. In Pennsylvania, they had over 300 victims, and I believe they are only capable of bringing charges on 3 that fell within the statute of limitations. In Colorado, they had 166 children who had been violated. They weren't able to bring prosecutions against any of those 166. There were 43 priests involved. In Iowa, they had a hotline in which they received 50 complaints. 45 of those involved Catholic priests. All of them were expired by the Catholic Church. Yes?
Knowing what you know now, would you recommend a change in Nebraska's statute of limitations as it relates to abused children?
Iowa last year removed the statute of limitations. We put in the report extensive history of what the Nebraska legislature has attempted to do. So you'll have both the history there in the report of the statute of limitations. Frankly, to be honest, it gets really confusing how to piece it together. But I do know that a member of the Nebraska legislature is looking at that very issue and working with the victim to see if that can be done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You said that only one person who has been proven to be an accuser is still working in the church in an administrative role.
Yes.
Are there others from your list that are still alive?
There are others who are still alive. When it was determined that we weren't able to prosecute to the statute of limitations, we have not had contact with those individuals. Some, we have no idea of knowing where they're at.
Are they subject to civil litigation by the victims at this point?
There's also statute of limitations that are applicable to civil litigation. That makes that very difficult also. Yeah, Andrew.
Are there any current bishops or administrators that are still working who are part of the cover-up or part of hiding some of these incidences?
I can't answer that as you, one of the things I think is important is these two graphs as to the decades. Some of the most egregious things that we saw were how matters were handled in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then again, as we said, with regards to after the Dallas Charter. I am really reluctant to answer that in a complete blanket way, Andrew, because although, as I said, the diocese has been cooperative, I'm not going to be in a position to give a blanket pass on that. But what I would find is the leadership, and what I mentioned in my comment, the leadership was generally cooperative in our investigation. I think what's obvious is it's a very painful history for the church, not just locally, but nationally. It's been very painful. The thing that's difficult and frustrating for us is that we've not been able to bring our own justice system to bear on those predators. And that's extremely frustrating. The only, I guess, message of hope that I would take from it is that if you look through all the policies and procedures from all the way from hiring, screening processes, all the way through operations and engagement with young children, they seem to have put safeguards that have made a difference. And there's kind of two ways I measure that. One is in our own hotline. Had those safeguards not been effective, we would not have been so many disproportionate victims prior to 2002. Ours after 2002 from our own hotline were very limited. The other thing is just within the other reports of the states of Pennsylvania and Colorado and Iowa are indicative once again that many of them were before 2002. But I'm not here to suggest it's a perfect system, because I understand, we understand in this business that pedophiles will do whatever they can to get access. And one of our biggest challenges now in 2021 is how it's now the internet, and how they can get and isolate a young person and develop those grooming tactics on the internet. So that gets much broader than just the church. But as far as the leadership, I think these two diagrams would show you where the primary leadership failures occurred, and those failures were significant and the harms were significant.
So, to double check, there's no prosecutions of predators for sex abuse coming out of.
That's correct.
What about cover-up? Did you consider, or are you considering any prosecutions for the failure to report?
Once again, as you read the report, and I recognize the report's very long, it's 170 some pages. If you read the reports, what you'll see is we identified dialogues that occurred in the church. And I think the thing that was most concerning is that some of the bishops and archbishops were in positions where they knew that something could be done, and they failed to act. And in the messaging that we saw in our review of files, it was placing the reputation of the church above the needs of the child, which is just incomprehensible and unacceptable.
Given all the interaction you've had with the church and all the steps it's seen it taken, if you had a son or grandson at the appropriate age, would you be comfortable with them becoming an altar boy today?
I tell you what, I don't know if I'd separate it to an altar boy. What I would say is I think the screening processes and other factors, and if we look just at the reporting numbers, we look at our hotlines, those policies and procedures have been in place for over 10, 15 years. In fact, arguably almost, if they adopted them immediately, almost 20 years. If they were not working, I would have expected a continued problem. And what's most troubling to me is this age group, the very thing you're identifying, these 11 to 14-year-old, 15-year-old boys. I would have expected that there were more incidents post 2002, and there really was not. So does that give me some degree of confidence that it's working? I think it is. But I think what we have to understand is, as parents, as grandparents, it's not unique to the Catholic Church. We hear incidents of high school teachers, coaches, youth sports. We know on the internet that the pedophiles are all over the place as predators trying to build relationships. We've prosecuted many cases here where they misrepresented themselves as something else or a certain age, and then set up meetings in which they actually sexually assaulted the child. That's why you'll see in my final comments is how important it is for we as communities engaged in whether we're within our church, whether within any youth organization, YMCA, mentoring programs to youth. We have to call the leadership of each one of those groups to adopt policies and procedures that do everything they can to protect. And there's simple policies and procedures. There's some of them. No one individual should, if you're working for our organization or in our church, you should never meet alone with a child. Always do it in a team of 2 or more. I mean, there's several policies that we have to hold our organizations accountable to. And if any of us are in a situation where leadership of the organization, the church, or any youth sport group suggests that we try to handle the matter internally without contacting law enforcement, you need to step forward and say, no, that's a big mistake. We have to go to law enforcement. So within the state of Nebraska, we have to establish a culture that children are more important than any institution, whether church, whether school, whether any organization that holds themselves out to care for children. Trying to spread it out.
I'm just going through the statute of limitations on the website right now, and it says that there shall not be any time limitation for prosecution or punishment of sexual assault of a child in the 2nd or 3rd degree or sexual assault of a child in the 1st degree. What interpretation are you finding in statute of limitations?
It's when that was adopted. It was going forward.
Okay.
So that's our problem.
Second question, what was the most recent difference?
We actually, the diocese provide us with 2 additional files, but just fairly recently, which I appreciate them doing that, but I can't remember the dates on those. Certainly know that when we were starting this matter up, the Townsend case was one, and we mentioned that in the report. Yep.
How many victims in the 80s or 90s came forward to current leadership and they did nothing? How many
Came forward to current leadership?
Yeah, like it stopped in the nineties as far as the abuse was, but
Right.
how many of them actually, it takes time for them to come forward.
Right.
How many of them came forward to the current archbishop or bishop and they did nothing?
You know, I believe we've contained the information in the reports as to where they may have come forward and spoke. I can't, as I stand here.
Because you mentioned in our schools, if it was a principal that was covering up abuse, that principal would be asked to step down immediately.
Right. No, and exactly, I mean, that is the tragedy of what we have here. Now, you're suggesting those in leadership now being presented historical information of an incident maybe in the nineties.
Well, I mean, it took me quite a while to come forward,
Right.
but I came forward to the current leadership. I know they're still not doing it correctly.
Let's see, yes?
How did it feel to learn that so many of these cases date back decades, and then some of the victims, like you said, in their seventies, just came forward for the first time when you opened the call center?
It was hard. So I could say. Yeah.
In my lifetime, I've been involved with an abused child, so I want to thank you and your officers for the effort to expose the problem. And certainly it's going to lead to some more corrections. So I appreciate that and thank you for that. You stated that in many cases you couldn't prosecute because of the statute of limitations. With that in mind, would you support a new statute of limitations for the state of Nebraska that permitted a look back for victims of abuse in the past? Would you support that?
Yeah, and as I understand, a senator is working on that, and I'd be glad to have our office speak into that, yes.
What senator is that, may I ask?
What's that?
What senator is that, may I ask?
I don't know if the senator's given me authority to say that. This legislative aide may be here to say that, yeah.
Yeah, that would be Senator Rick Pauls.
Senator Powell's from Omaha. And you are his legislative assistant?
Yes.
Andrew?
One of the factors in on whether or not.
Andrew, can you pull the mask down so?
Sorry, one of the factors that we go into whether or not you go after some of these people who covered up this, some of these cases.
It's primarily the same problem. It's the statute of limitations. The one that would both restrict criminal prosecution for the assaults also would affect failure to disclose a report. Grant?
Did you ever get an explanation in your investigation, from the people who were accused of covering up, why they did that, or was there any explanation given at all?
We did not, as I said, some of the more apparent cover-ups occurred in the 80s and 90s of the prior bishops. I think frankly, when you saw some of the statements that were made about placing the church above the reputation of the church, they were statements where they basically said this could be a real problem. I think probably also, and this is no secret, came out from the Boston report, and it's been one I've heard several people express. One of the greatest concerns is instead of identifying, investigating, turn it over to law enforcement at the outset, what they would do is just move them on to other parishes. Maybe some training, counseling, and then on to another parish. To a parish who then receives them. So I think that was one of the most frustrating things that we could not respond to, and that the church needs to bear responsibility for. The other thing that I think, as you look at the numbers and evaluate the numbers, I think it is important to note that there are two names that really significantly impact the numbers. Within the Lincoln Diocese, Monsignor Kalin, who was at the Newman Center at the University of Nebraska, he acknowledged in some of the reported information we had over 50 victims. And those would have been oftentimes freshmen, sophomore University of Nebraska students who were associated with the ministries at the Newman Center. So that number has a significant impact. particularly as you look at this in the nineties, right there, that is a significant impact. And then obviously in Omaha, over 40 of the victims were, I can't even put the word father in front of his name, as Herrick. And those were 40 plus. So those do have a big impact on the numbers, but I mean, this goes all the way back to 30s and 40s in some of the cases, and I'm not gonna pretend that I don't know what percentage of the true story we've got of the number of victims. It could be significantly more. Yes?
I might have missed this, but do you have a number of offenders? How many people were?
Yes, we have 57.
And that's in all three dioceses?
It is, and I think that's broken down. I don't have that in my notes. You'll see, when you go to the index of the report, you'll see, and I think it's, around 14 from the Lincoln Diocese, and it's 40-some in the Omaha Diocese.
Out of those 57, how many have been prosecuted?
I don't know exactly. In the report we talk about, obviously Herrick was prosecuted. I know Fiala was prosecuted, but I can't give you an exact number. You'll see in our report, what we attempted to do is go through a systematic process of identifying the priest, the nature of the allegations, if possible, the age of the victim, was it reported, and then the ultimate outcome. A lot of these names are going to have already been published through the investigations done by the Omaha Diocese and the Lincoln Diocese. So some of these names people will be well aware of. There were just a few additional ones that we felt were substantiated and should be included in the report.
Can you talk about Herrick a little more? You said more than 40 victims?
Yes.
Is that the largest number for an offender?
Well, with regards to Kalen at the Newman Center, he admits to over 50, and those were typically showers and other things by young freshman, sophomore college students. That's in the report. Herrick, we identify, I believe, 26 victims where we go through and explain the degree of conduct. His were all that 11 to 14 year age, and it's gut wrenching, as I said, to look at what these young children were subject to.
And they moved him to different parishes.
And then he was ultimately, what happened is basically a cleaning lady was in his home and found some photographs and a video. And based upon that, he was criminally prosecuted, and then there was also civil litigation. Yeah.
So Fiala was prosecuted, but after the Archbishop of Omaha took him quietly out of state, and then he went to another state, and he was raping a boy and trying to hire an FBI hitman, right?
Yeah. I believe that was in Texas.
Right, or maybe it was a Texas Ranger. Right, so he was prosecuted, but not because of the actions of Nebraska church officials.
Right.
Which brings me back to my other question. Yes, I appreciate the answering, but I just want to finally point it. Are you considering any prosecutions, and did you consider any prosecutions of church officials who failed to report or otherwise covered up?
Again, did we consider, we looked at the conduct, but frankly, when you get into the certain incidents of the conduct and understand that it occurred outside the statute of limitations of our authority, as prosecutors, we're not in a position to correct the problem. And that's probably what was most frustrating in all of this. And what I think one of the things we find, and I'll ask you a question, but one of the things we find is that currently, the statute of limitations is certainly what the church recognizes, and it's not my place or our place as prosecutors to go to the depth of relationship between church and its members, although I found a lot of that was difficult to read.
Is the investigation over?
we will continue to take information, but yes. And I've gotta tell you, this investigation took a long time. You look at Pennsylvania, that was a grand jury, that went through that process. The Colorado investigation was done by outside, specialist, and then the Iowa one was done internally. Ours was done internally, and as the end of 2018 into 2019, most of 2019, we were in the process of simply gathering facts, gathering as much information and resources, getting responses to subpoenas and things of that nature. We had the Lincoln Police Department do an extraordinary amount of file review, along with one primary investigator in our office. Meanwhile, that primary investigator in our office was helping out. During that time period, we had 18 murder cases that we were prosecuting during that time, which would include Boswell, Trail, Kittle, 18 of these cases across the state, where most of them were tried, and that special investigator was engaged in all of those cases. He also personally had his wife, who was going through quite serious health issues, and I want to thank Kerry for his devotion to this and how much he cared. And I think he talked to a lot of people. During that time, lost his wife. So it's been a big strain on the office, both emotionally, because no one finds it very easy to go through this material. And then frankly, I know he's just left, but law officers have hearts. That's why they do this work, and it gets to them also. So it took a long time to get to the end to do this report. Is it closed? No, we'll take additional information. We always believe that, as I said, it's a priority in this office. You can also go to your local law enforcement agency, wherever you're at, but if you'd rather bring it to our office, we'll receive it and investigate. I know I had heard, and people were wanting to know, where's the report, where's the report? I wanted to make sure that we prioritized thoroughness over expediency, and so that's why it's taken longer than I expected. Yeah.
I just find it hard to still continue to trust the leadership when credible pedophiles are allowed to live across the street from a Catholic school, and they're allowed to retire right next door to a Boy Scout. And that's the current leadership overseeing that and still making that okay.
I would say it's not my role, it's the members' roles to let their expectations be known to their church.
Thank you for what you've done, I appreciate it.
And what I would say is, again, as a community, how important this is, because when you see the harm, and I think the 12-year-old who wanted to trust and how it affected him.
It typically takes many years sometimes for victims of child sexual abuse to actually come forward. So when you look at the numbers, say for Omaha, which implemented the Dallas Charter, I'd say a little bit more fully than the Lincoln Diocese did. You look at the 2000s, they actually had an increase from the 90s, and then a material decrease in 2010s. And, when you think about the fact that somebody that was abused in 2010 as a 10-year-old would only be around 20 right now, around college age, is there something else in the data that makes you say that the Dallas Charter worked or is working?
No, and I think that's a good point. I think that's our experience, that what I would say is, from policy and procedure, none of that was really in existence from what I can tell. So now it's implemented, particularly the screening and the profiles of what to look for in a pedophile. But I think you're exactly right, that what we found is when we got on the hotline, someone who's 75 years old and hasn't told anyone about this for 60 years. A lot of the victims, what I saw happening in some of the information was either the kid immediately went to someone they trusted, particularly a family member, and then the family member tried to advocate, and in the older cases, were very frustrated in not taking the allegations seriously and acting promptly. That was one that you saw. The other one you saw gets back to the shame and the fear of reprisal and oh no. You know, it was not uncommon for people to, as you said, 10, 20, 30 years. And some of the calls we got were from family members who said, my brother's not gonna call you, but here's what he told me 5 years ago of what happened 30 years ago. So you're exactly right. A lot of times it's such a painful psychological scar. And I actually encourage anyone who might be listening who's dealt with it and has not come out and spoken to someone that you need to do that. In some ways this is a feeble attempt to have their voices be heard. But it's so frustrating that, yes, your voice can be heard, but we're not able to bring you criminal resolution. Yeah?
Are there other victims that reported their abuse even to law enforcement at the time that it happened and nothing was done?
There are a few cases where I saw that the charges were not brought. Yeah. This is your last one, Andy.
Can I do a two-parter? I guess number one, was there anybody that came forward that you deemed as not credible? Any non-credible reports? Also, you talked about human cost. What were some of the stories of what happened to some of these people?
Well, as to your second question, I'm just gonna ask you to read the report because frankly, it's too tough for me to go through. Frankly, Andrew, I'm forgetting your first question.
Was there any report that you guys took that you found to be not credible?
I can think of a couple. And now, frankly, I'm getting a little bit confused of whether or not those are current cases that we're looking at outside the report, where what was ultimately determined was that the accuser was inconsistent in such a way that they lost credibility. And that's classic with any investigation. I'm just not sure if I'm merging some of our current cases with this investigation. The greater problem was victims who were credible and they weren't listened to. And in fact, there's one report, there's a document where a priest went away, and I think it was in the area of Florida, and the allegations weren't treated, as to the girl who was the victim, were not treated as valid. They were discounted. And once that priest was down in Florida and they did further investigation, they said, no, this is very credible. And they, in fact, suggested that maybe the diocese up here needed to look at it more carefully. And I can't remember the name of that particular case, but it was one, to me, of a really unfortunate example of failing to do their job. Yeah.
In those cases where somebody did report it, but no action was taken, wouldn't that still be allowed to be opened and set the statute of limitations aside because it was reported within the period?
No, I don't believe so. If a prosecutor looked at a case, chose not to pursue the case, and the statute of limitations ran, we don't have a magic wand that causes us to come in. And we've had situations in this office, cases where something was brought to our attention because they felt they weren't getting it resolved in their community, and it's run up right against the statute of limitations, but we're under that same statute of limitations process.
What was that statute of limitations? How many years?
In that particular case?
Just in general, prior to
Well,
the change in the statute.
I tell you what, when you read the report and you see the 8 pages on the statute of limitations, you'll realize that I don't have a simple answer I can give you. It's really transpired, and it's transpired over a period of time because the Nebraska legislature has realized how egregious and the impact the very thing we talked about, how long it takes. And frankly, it's very difficult to prosecute a case with witnesses that date back, 30, 40 years. It's a real challenge. So even though if you extend it back to capture some of these, there will always be a challenge of whether or not you have sufficient factual information to go forward. One more, Grant.
Was there, obviously, I can tell it was difficult to, conduct this investigation. Was there anything the reporter the investigation that surprised you? Anything you weren't expecting?
I don't think so. If anything, two things that I guess I could say surprised me. One is that there weren't a greater volume between 2000 and to the time we did the hotline. I think this gentleman over here kind of pinpointed that, but I thought we would get more volume, more recent volume. The other thing that surprised me is we know that this is not a problem limited to the Catholic Church. I think what happened with our hotline in light of the Pennsylvania grand jury report, I think it just put kind of a cloud of Catholic Church over reports. And the fact of the matter is, we know it's not unique to one church, one denomination, and it's not as if any denomination has come out with a pure record on something like this. I was also a little surprised that we didn't have more victims from school settings, public, parochial, because we see reports all the time of sexual predators, inappropriate behavior by teachers with students. And we also know that historically in criminal prosecution, the pedophiles will try to make contacts through other youth-related organizations. And I was a little surprised. I was surprised of the 120 calls that only one of them was outside of that. As I said, I think that had something to do with the fact that just in July, a month before that, the Pennsylvania grand jury came out. All right. Once again, I just been wrapping up. I want to thank